Diplomatic history seeks to promote the use of history as a means of enhancing our understanding of modern challenges in foreign policy, international security, and related fields, as well as to create connections between policy researchers and policy makers in Washington and historians around the country whose work has bearing on the contemporary policy debate. If you're interested in learning more about our project, feel free to sign up for our email updates at csis.org. We host regular events like these that are open to the public, and we welcome all comers. For those who are interested, next Thursday, March 15th, we're partnering with the U.S. Army Center of Military History to host a panel discussion on the 50th anniversary of the My Lai massacre. The panel will consist of Vietnam War historians, military legal experts who will share their thoughts on the history and legacy of the My Lai tragedy and the lessons we can draw from this dark episode in American military history. Today, we're fortunate to be joined by Dr. Robert Citino to discuss his latest book, The Wehrmacht's Last Stand, The German Campaigns of 1944 and 1945. Dr. Citino is the Samuel Zemurray Stone Senior Historian at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. He's the author of 10 books on World War II, German military history, and the evolution of military operations more broadly. Wehrmacht's Last Stand is his third book covering the campaigns of the German army during World War II, following two other critically acclaimed works which covered the Wehrmacht's operations in 1942 and 1943. Prior to joining the World War II Museum, Dr. Citino has held academic posts at a number of educational institutions across the country, including the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and the U.S. Army War College. Please welcome Dr. Robert Citino.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Just make sure I'm that good. You might want to leave a copy of my book here in case I need a quick quote. Greetings from New Orleans, and it's wonderful to be here in Washington, D.C. I'd forgotten what it's like to be cold at all, and today was a kind of Stalingrad moment for me. I was asked to talk about my most recent book, which is as you've heard, The Wehrmacht's Last Stand, the German campaigns in 1944-1945. I think the way we'll play it today is I'll give what I think is a précis of the book, highlighting its good points and maybe even talking about some places where I think it might have been better, and then we'll have some back and forth conversation today. It should be fun. I'm looking forward to it. I think if there's, well, I was always asked to have an elevator speech about your book, or in some cases something shorter than that, just a quick sentence. And if there's a sentence I think that would sum up the material, sum up the argument of the Wehrmacht's Last Stand, it's that he didn't do it all by himself. And he, of course, by he I mean the Fuhrer, the leader of Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler, and by it I mean fighting, planning, and losing World War II. Standing alongside Hitler was a corps of highly trained professionals, Army officers especially, and it's the Army that I've concentrated on because it's the Army that was 90% of the German war effort, at least after the midpoint. The Navy had almost ceased to exist as a surface fleet, and the Air Force was whittled down to almost nothing by the time 1944 rolls around. So Army officers especially. Army officers who supported Hitler's launch of the war in 1939, who worked tirelessly to put his plans into action, and who remained fiercely loyal to him to the very end. And then, when the war was over, turned around and wrote memoirs denying that they had done any of these things. And that is, in essence, what I've talked about in the course of this book. You know, when you're writing a book, your publisher will often say, what's the arc? And this was a tough one, if you think about it, because the Germans are getting beaten very badly in 1944, and that's the beginning of the book, and then they're getting beaten very, very badly for the next 600 pages, and then they're blown into smithereens on the last page. And so there, you know, there's not that kind of arc. Like, there's not a turning point of the war that's being discussed here. But what is happening is that the situation is becoming more dire literally by the week, and yet the officer corps and virtually all of the manpower of the Army remains loyal to the cause to the very, very end. And that's what I sought to explain in the course of this book. And that, to me, was an interesting historical problematic. That does require some explanation, because it's bad in 1944, but it's worse in the middle of of 1944, and it's worse still by the end of the year. And what is keeping those soldiers, but especially those officers, loyal to the cause? So that is, if you're wondering what the Wehrmacht's Last Stand is about, how this could possibly be different from the other million books written on World War II, that's it, particularly written on the German army. It's written almost exclusively from German language sources as well. And that would give it a certain je ne sais quoi, to mix my languages, that perhaps other books on the topic do not have. So it's a sad fact to me, but when the generals wrote those memoirs after the war, when they said those things, we tended to believe them. They were men of breeding and wealth and taste and from fine families. Many of them were highly skilled military operators. No one denies that today. The names Rommel and Guderian and Manstein. These are highly skilled military operators. They may even have deserved the often overused title of genius, which we throw around for any general who can walk and chew gum at the same time becomes known as a genius to military historians. We're a very credulous and supportive bunch. But I think in this case, we might actually make the case. So, they wrote things that denied, that pled their ignorance of the horrific crimes that Germany had committed. The Wehrmacht, they said, had fought a good war, a clean war. They had clean hands in 1945, and they blamed the mass murders and the other atrocities on the thugs in the Nazi Party, especially the sort of parallel military force of the Waffen-SS. Now, you don't have to scratch the surface of the material very deeply to realize that when they said these things, there's only one problem with them, and that's they're all false. The documentary record is so clear on this point that it hardly bears any debate today. The Officer Corps backed Hitler's rearmament program schemes in the 1930s. It meant rapid promotion in an army that had been almost devoid of promotion for 15 straight years. They supported the invasion of Poland in 1939, the invasion of France in 1940, after some initial misgivings. And they didn't make a peep when Hitler decided to invade the USSR in 1941 in Operation Barbarossa. They were as certain as he was that they'd be victorious in a few months. Even as the war turned hopeless, they followed Hitler's orders to hold on, no matter what the cost. Halten jeden Preis is Hitler's phrase. He said it so often that they could probably predict when he was going to say it. To fight until 5 minutes past midnight, if that's what it took. Despite their claims, they put their men and equipment and energy and time at the disposal of the killing squads. The Holocaust could not have happened without their administrative support. That is the administrative support of army officers on the Eastern Front. Even as defeat became certain, they could see the writing on the wall. They said so often enough. They were professionals, after all, and can read a map. They kept going. They groused in private, but obeyed their orders and launched their outclassed Lancers, their equivalent of G.I. Joe, into one hopeless battle after the other, getting millions of their own men killed for no reason in the last year of the war, no strategic reason that could possibly be adduced. Now, there was a plot to kill Hitler, and you're a savvy group in the audience, and I'm sure you know that, on July 20th, 1944, set a bomb in his headquarters in East Prussia and killed a few people in the room and did a great deal of damage. Unfortunately, none of the people killed was named Adolf Hitler, so the plot failed. The conspirators there were colonels. Klaus von Stauffenberg, I'm thinking. It was a revolt, in other words, of the middle managers, not the senior staff, not the C-suite or the executive wing. So the question, and again, it is the heart of the book, why did they stay so loyal even after defeat was certain? They often claim it was because of their oath. But I think it's more complicated than that, because German officers took all kinds of oaths in their career. They took an oath to serve the Weimar Republic. They served an oath to defend the Constitution of the Weimar Republic, which included obedience and to the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty. So they broke the one to the Constitution, and they violated the Versailles Treaty any moment they got. So, we all know this. There's oaths and there's oaths, and apparently the German officers felt that as well. But let me give 4 quick reasons why I think we make the argument what caused the German army, the German officer corps especially, to remain in the field. Certainly, one factor that kept them fighting so tenaciously was their fear of Soviet revenge should the Red Army break into Germany. They all said that in their memoirs, and I think it's actually true. They knew exactly what they had done in the Soviet Union. They had good reason to be worried. And Soviet troops did indeed behave atrociously on German soil, killing and looting and raping as a horror. Still today, it's a horrible story. I think the Soviet Union lost the Cold War in the last moments of World War II by its behavior in Berlin. So they had good reason to fear Soviet revenge, and maybe that was what kept them in the field. A second factor that they often call to mind is the Allied declaration at the Casablanca Conference in 1943 that the Allies were fighting for unconditional surrender. So there seemed to be no real alternative, the generals claimed, but to fight on till the bitter end. Now, it's a rare thing, if you study military history, to demand unconditional surrender from your adversary. Typically, when the adversary's been beaten, and knows he's been beaten, emissaries are sent out to some neutral corner, and some kind of armistice is hammered out, and then that leads to a peace treaty. So the Germans claim that. I mean, we could argue it, but at least we'll leave it hanging out there and say it's plausible. It's a prima facie case you can make for unconditional surrender. But here's something they didn't say in their memoirs that we know all too well today. Hitler was bribing them all to the hilt, providing them with what were called in German Dotationen. The translation into English is a word we don't use. It's an archaicism. Dotations, an old Prussian word for an award from the king. That is, you've done service to the monarch, and then the monarch, in his gratitude to you, pays you some kind of reward. Now, in the German context of 1944-45, these were immense cash payments deposited directly into generals' bank accounts every month the war went on. There were bonuses for special events. For example, 250,000 Reichsmarks for your 50th or 60th birthday. It's very tough to exactly what does that mean in today's money and today's purchasing power, but let's estimate $2 to $3 million. So a bonus for your 50th or 60th birthday. They also received huge landed estates in the occupied territories, carved out of land seized from their rightful owners, and you all know where the rightful owners probably were by this point, either dead or in camp somewhere awaiting their deaths. Late in the war, October of 1944, Erich von Manstein, one of the great German field marshals and one of the most skilled military operators of the 20th century, sent out his scouts into Pomerania to look for a suitable landed estate. You know, the Soviet armies were probably 25 miles away. You can probably hear the artillery fire in the background. And the notion that Manstein was ever going to, curl up in front of the fireplace with a pipe and have a relaxing evening on his new estate is laughable. It calls into question, I suppose, his strategic acumen. Perhaps he was merely trying to do that to lay a claim for any kind of post-war settlement. That's what I've always thought, at any rate. So I have the deed to this property if that ever did matter in some kind of post-war settlement. Maybe memory made them do it. I've thought about this one a lot. And in fact, a lot of my book is about this fourth point. Maybe memory made them do it. We have to remember that these were the same officers who had fought and lost the previous time out. They fought and lost World War I. To a man, they believed they had lost because Germany threw in the towel too soon. And Germany had thrown in the towel too soon due to a kind of rot on the home front. The infamous phrase that still percolates around German historiographical circles is they believed that the army had been stabbed in the back by the home front, by socialists and pacifists and vegetarians, and all sorts of people who lacked the stomach for the fight to the end. And of course, this being the German officer corps, a group that leaned to the right in any circumstances, and now they've been radicalized in the current formulation. That also included Germany's Jews. There's a massive uptick in anti-Semitism amongst the German officer corps after World War I as well. So, rot on the home front. That's one thing that didn't seem to be happening in 1944 and 1945. Hitler seemed to have solved that problem. The German people were standing firm behind Hitler, and in fact they would till the very end. So there was no one amongst them, really, amongst the officer corps, who wished to be the first to stand up and say what many of them were privately thinking. We've lost. And so they fought on again through one bloody campaign after the other. By far, the bloodiest year of World War II is the last year of the war. That surprises us sometimes. Wars sometimes trail off at the end and everyone loses momentum, but That's not how World War II went. World War II just ended in a bloodbath, and that was the final year of the war. You know, interestingly enough, there's one component from this list, one item from this list that's missing. None of them ever said they were afraid. We didn't do it because we were afraid of Hitler. Afraid for our lives. Afraid that Hitler would kill them if they disobeyed. He had relatively few generals executed in the course of the war. A handful, in matter of fact, probably about 10 arrested and a handful of that actually executed. Unlike Stalin, who executed generals by the bucket load all through the war, especially in the early years of the war. If we could say one thing about a typical German general, this is probably absolutely unafraid of death. They tended to command from the front, which is why so many of them died and were killed, I should say, in the course of military action in the Second World War. The number that is usually pointed to by historians, you have to argue a little bit both ways. 676 German generals killed in the fighting in World War II. Compared to, I don't know the exact number for the Americans, it's in double digits. Less than 50, certainly, and probably a lot less than that. Just not how American generals played the game. They weren't in the front line carrying out a reconnaissance through field glasses. They tended to be administrators. I'm thinking of a Courtney Hodges or a William Simpson behind the lines and making sure that the logistics were right and that the administration and organization was tight. So, fear, politics, money, memory. They were all at play in keeping the generals going. Or maybe, and as I researched this book, I was forced to confront an unpleasant reality. Maybe some of them just felt like it. And I ask you to consider the case of Field Marshal Ferdinand Schörner. Here was a truly, for lack of a better term, here was a truly bad guy. A fanatic, National Socialist fanatic, a true believer in Hitler. His operational signature was shooting thousands of his own men for cowardice, in order to terrify the others into obedience. He liked to fly to the front. The German commanders have this little Fieseler Storch aircraft. It's quite light. It takes about 50-foot runway to take off. It's incredible. So you can land literally in the middle of the street. He liked to come down in his little command plane up the front, do a brief inspection, then mete out death sentences on the flimsiest of evidence. After the attempt on Hitler's life in July of 1944, Schörner would open staff meetings by asking his officers around the table, how many men did you hang today? He seemed to think it was an important aspect of command. How many men did you hang today? On several occasions, he had dogs shot who were barking too loudly outside his command post. You're reading this, so I already read that account, and they say, no, this is apparently a different dog. So it happened on more than one account, more than one occurrence. He once visited a tank repair shop where a crew was waiting to get a vehicle fixed, and Schörner had the commander shot for malingering. He once had 22 men shot for the crime of standing around without orders. He was driving around late in the war. This is very late in the war, and troop was at rest for a moment, and he ordered them executed, apparently for no reason at all. All this took place again in the very end of the war, with Germany collapsing in ruins all around him, and Hitler, getting ready and then actually killing himself. The retreat path of Schörner's armies was marked by thousands of German soldiers hung from lampposts on charges of cowardice, malingering, desertion, and the like. He appalled many of his own colleagues, which always says something. People tolerate almost anything, but you ask their colleagues what they're like. He appalled many of his own colleagues. One fellow general, Dietl it was, once said, Ferdinand, who do you think you are? A cop? In other words, the art of command is not catching your men in various forms of disobedience to regulations. The art of command is commanding, and commanding towards victory, hopefully. Ferdinand was acting more like a cop in the term of opprobrium to his fellow officers. Just days before the end of the war, Ferdinand Schörner was commanding Army Group Center in Bohemia, today Czech Republic. He issued his last order of the day to his troops. A quote, "In these hard days, we must not lose our nerves or become cowards. Any man abandoning his post will suffer the most dire consequences." He threatened to hang, in other words, any man abandoning his post. Now, a few days later, Schörner got into his private aircraft and abandoned his post. He was facing the Russians, and as you might expect, he had no desire to fall into the hands of the Russians. Who do you want to be taken prisoner by? The Western forces, the British or Americans. So he abandoned his men to their fate as Soviet POWs, reached the safety of U.S. lines, and this makes me proud to be an American. We handed him back over to the Soviets, who held him as a prisoner for the next 10 years, doing time next to the very men he had left in the lurch. And he often had to be protected by Soviet guards from his own men while in prison. He was freed in late 1954. He returned to West Germany, what was West Germany now, to angry outbursts from many of his former soldiers and their families. He went on trial there, too, and he spent 4 more years in prison. When he got out in 1959, I want to say, because I think the trial was 55, I have a letter. He was in Munich at the time. He's a Bavarian by birth. So he was in Munich at the time, and I have a letter that he wrote to the Bavarian transport asking why he had not been granted the free train pass that was his due as a returning veteran. And I never saw the answer, but there's a couple ways we could answer that question. So the point is, Schörner, almost unheard of today, next to the Mansteins and the Guderians and the Rommels, the people I've spent my career writing about. But the Schörners are kind of unknown today. But he is a prime example of a late war German general. He was loyal, all right, but loyal up. Loyal to Hitler. There's many different kinds of loyalty expected of a military commander, and one of them, of course, is loyalty to the men under your command, some concern for the lives of the men who are serving under your command. You know, I'll end with the words of wisdom from the dean of World War II historians, the kind of pope of our field, Gerhard Weinberg, who once described the end of the war with this phrase, the German war: huge bribes for some at the top, and bullets for thousands at the bottom. It was commanders like Schörner, in the end, who allowed it to happen, in fact, who made it happen. And that would be my reminder for today's lesson, is that Hitler did not fight World War II all by himself. Thank you very much. Very beautiful, thank you.
So I wanted to start out, and you talk about these generals who are getting up to the end of the war and can kind of see the writing on the wall that this is not going to end well for them. But they're still fighting for this variety of reasons, and in some cases, like you mentioned, possibly planning for after the war, or staking out claim to property and whatnot. How did they see their situation after the war inevitably ended, given the propensity of the Soviets to exact revenge on them, their experience in World War I, and the settlement that I'm sure they thought would get repeated, in whatever form? How did they see themselves after the Nazi government inevitably falls?
Good question. So there's a German historian by the name of Sönke Neitzel who's written a really good book that has been translated into English as Tapping Hitler's Generals. Now, these are German generals who've been captured by the British and Americans and who are in various British prisoner of war camps in Britain, on the island of Britain. And unbeknownst to them, their conversations were being taped. And so this is like the greatest source of all time. No one is really willing to stand up and say, well, that wasn't a very ethical thing to do. Remember, gentlemen don't read each other's mail, as was thought in World War II. Well, evidently, after the bloodletting of World War II, you did read each other's mail. And we have very frank discussions amongst the German generals. And some then are still defending Hitler. A large number of them are still defending Hitler. And some are saying, this war was a mess from the start. And very often there's a great deal of tension within this once solid cohort of German officers, and arguing about minor details of the war, about the logistics at the Kasserine Pass and whether or not the panzers should have gone for Dnepropetrovsk in 1941. I mean, it's grist for the mill of an operational military historian such as myself. But one of the generals they're sitting around discussing their post-war prospects, and one famous a quote that comes out of this, one of the infantry commanders on the Eastern Front said, before this war we were colonels and generals, and after this war we're going to be shoeshine boys and bellhops. So, I mean, we are talking about an elite. We're talking about a social elite, and not just a social elite of the Third Reich. It's not a 12-year, 33 to 45 social elite. It's a social elite, and start going back to the Prussians, dating back 300 and 400 years, at least to the time of the great elector, the ruler who made Brandenburg Prussia a power in Central Europe. So there's no doubt. I mean, at least when we read this, Sam, we can say that, yeah, well, I understand that. You've been at the pinnacle, and now you're going to be scuffling for your daily bread. We can understand that. I think the vast majority of them in wartime knew that it would be a very good idea to surrender to the West. Mm-hmm. Now, unfortunately, 80% of them were in the East. 80% of the army was in the East. And so the Soviets captured hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of prisoners, and of the officer corps, higher ranking officers and generals. And that's been published now, too. Interrogations of Schörner was held by the reason we know about Schörner, he was held by the Soviets for 10 straight years. And so we have chapter and verse of Schörner's interrogation, his testimony before various Soviet tribunals, what they'd been thinking during the war, why they followed Hitler. Schörner was, if you admire this sort of thing, Schörner remained hardcore under Soviet interrogation. He didn't appear to have been tortured in the classic Beria, NKVD, 1938 style, but of course neither was he particularly well treated in captivity. But he said repeatedly that the war was a preventive one to forestall a Soviet attack, and no matter how many times his interrogators said that's not true, you can't possibly believe that, you had no evidence. He stuck to the story. So there's I think they were looking at their diminution in importance in Prussian society, and they were going to be down on the social scale. They were also going to be in a country they knew that would be divided, and that would be that at least the eastern half would be under communist domination. So for all those reasons, I think another sensible reason you say why did the German officers keep fighting is that they're fighting the Soviet Union. They were not looking forward to a Soviet occupation of the homeland. Now, of course, they had started that mess in the first place by invading the Soviet Union, and they might be wanting to think about that, but you act in haste, and of course you have leisure time to repent.
Sure.
They all thought that was going to be a 6-week campaign. Just the French campaign had been so simple. There was no army that could possibly stand up to the Wehrmacht in 1941. The first campaign bore that out for a few months, didn't it? 4 million casualties, 3 million Soviet prisoners in those opening battles. So I think there's an amalgam of emotions and motives going through their minds. I'm trying to unpack and untangle them a bit.
All right. Well then, so kind of the flip side of that, you talk a lot in the book about, the high officer corps, the general officers, and a few colonels in there. I'm curious what you can tell us about motivation of junior officers and the average soldier, in this same time period, who I'm sure is thinking much similar things about where this war is going in the face of continuous crushing defeats, especially there's the great chapter where you just line up one after the other, this army group surrounded and destroyed, and this next, and men, fighting their way for weeks back to the German lines. And
the feeling, the sentiment amongst the rank and file, in other words, the Germans have this marvelous term, Lanzer. It means ground pounder. In the same way we would talk about a foot soldier. So the opinion amongst the Lanzers is interesting. There's been a few books that have looked into motivations of the German soldier. I think of Stephen Fritz's great book, Frontsoldaten, the Frontline Soldier, it's called. He largely, you wouldn't really say prime archival sources, but he largely based what he had to say on his reading of correspondence between German soldiers at the front and their families and back and forth. And he paints a picture of a German force that was pretty thoroughly ideologized and pretty thoroughly Nazified, insofar as being Nazified means absolute loyalty to Hitler, a belief that somehow the Fuhrer will concoct a stratagem to get us out of this mess, as so often he led us to the brink in the 1930s and always seemed to concoct some kind of stratagem to get us out of those messes. Opinion, morale within the Stalingrad Kessel. So the encirclement at Stalingrad. Soviet armies encircled the German 6th Army in November, and so it's all of the rest of November, all of December, and all of January. It's 70 days in an encirclement. As food runs out, and as water runs out, and as medicine runs out, and as everything you can imagine, until these men are kind of walking skeletons. Morale held firm in the Stalingrad pocket until about the last week. till I think the food ran out. And then it was increasingly clear that Hitler wasn't riding to their rescue. And now that's I'm looking at it as a general statement, of course. Sure. It's different for each individual. Soldierly morale, is essence, has to be boiled down to the personal level. But let's go to July 20th, 1944, the unsuccessful attempt on Hitler's life, the bomb plot in the East Prussian headquarters. Most frontline soldiers were absolutely appalled. Not that Hitler had survived. They were appalled that there was a plot within the officer corps to kill the supreme commander. It's just the kind of rot they'd read about at the end of the war in World War I, when there was all kinds of opinion within the new draftees and the new officer corps. War weariness was multiplying across the countryside and didn't fail to infect the armed forces. And they felt they'd been pretty immune to that, and so. I'm thinking of Walter Model, who was a field marshal on the Eastern Front, and he hears about the plot, and he gets in his car, and his chauffeur, who's an enlisted man, says, "Thank God it wasn't a Lancer." In other words, it's one of yours. It's an officer. So it would be comforting to think that ordinary folk, ordinary German soldiers at the front, remained immune from what we consider to be these repugnant outbursts of ideological anti-Semitism and the notion that Germany really was spearheading a global anti-Bolshevik crusade. It'd be comforting to think that German soldiers had too hard-headed and too much folk wisdom to fall for that sort of thing. But I think the record there is pretty clear. Let's remember who these young men were. Let's do some quick math. If you're 20 in 1944, you're born in 1924, and so you've been in the Hitler Youth since you were 9. And so from 9 to 19, you were in the Hitler Youth, and you were hearing one kind of story, one kind of narrative. We all say we're immune to advertising. What do they call it when you don't have network or cable TV? I've cut the cable, and I just watch Netflix and Hulu nowadays, so I don't have ads. And so I realize how I've been liberated in a sense. I say we don't really are not moved by advertising or propaganda, but of course we are. That's why people spend so much money on propagandizing and advertising. So I think I'd like to draw that dichotomy between the soldier and the officer. Say the higher you were, the closer you were to Hitler, the more likely to be loyal. Further down, the less likely. But I'm just not sure that's true.
Mm-hmm. On a different note, so this book starts in 1944 in January, and at this point in the war, the Wehrmacht already looks like it's not in good shape. It's undermanned.
Not in good shape. The understatement.
Undermanned, undersupplied. Constantly exposed to air attack. It's almost looks like at this point it's just a matter of time. But you've also in your last two books talked in 1942 and 1943. And I wanted to know if, not the classic question of how could Germany have won the war, but maybe when was there a point of no return between 1942 and 1943 where there wasn't really anything that, on the operational level, that commanders could change to change the outcome of the war or change the trajectory of the war, where it was just, they kind of just had to react and they didn't have any choices?
I think this brings us to the question of whether the Germans were really pursuing a strategy in World War II, and it's one I'm asked a lot. Matter of fact, I talked at the U.S. Marine Corps War College yesterday. I addressed the student body there on this very question of what was German strategy in the war. So it's a question I have to deal with a lot. The standard take on the Germans is that they relied too heavily on military operations. That is, they fought campaign and battle well, so operations and tactics, very astute, but exactly how were they linking those operations and individual battles into some cohesive whole that would lead to victory in a war? That is the consensus. I trace the growth of that outlook of an operations-heavy war all the way back to the Prussians, and Prussia was a fairly small kingdom, hemmed in by enemies and potential enemies, and those mighty France in the west and mighty Russia in the east and mighty Austria in the south, and at least in the period of the 17th century, mighty Sweden in the north. No one worries about the Swedes very much anymore. People worried about them a great deal at the time. And so they evolved this kind of war that said we can't really win a long war of attrition. We can never outproduce or outman our enemies. What we can do is outthink them on the battlefield and outfight them in terms of aggression in tactical encounters. And so they evolved this method of war called the war of movement, Bewegungskrieg. Not Blitzkrieg, which is an invention of Western journalists in the 30s and 40s, but Bewegungskrieg, the war of movement, which is large units from division on up, division corps armies maneuvering in such a way as to attack the adversary from multiple directions at once. They called that a Kesselschlacht, a cauldron battle or a battle of encirclement. And that really was their art of war. About things like, long-term industrial production, well, we'll work that out as we go. If things go well, we won't really need long-term industrial production. We'll have won the war in the opening weeks. Things like intelligence and counterintelligence and the logistics and production, the kinds of things that the Western powers are so good at in World War II, just never really been on the front burner. If you were a very skilled German officer, you went into the maneuver arms. Certainly didn't go into the signal corps or logistics, as often happened in the United States Army, for example. So that's an inadequate way of war, and that's why you can say, well, that's why the Germans went 0 for 2. And the only 2 at-bats that counted in the 20th century, the Germans went 0 for 2. But if you look at the opening years of World War II, any sensible person would say, well, maybe that was a pretty good gamble. The Germans opened the war, of course, with a strike into Poland and overran the Polish army in a matter of 18 days of fighting. There'd be another week plus to overrun the capital. Hitler then wanted to immediately turn on the French. You may know this. Within days of the Polish campaign, he ordered his officers to draw plans for the invasion of the West. They dragged their feet a bit, but they got on board. They did what they were told. A little passive aggressiveness. They didn't really come up with the most exciting plan, but Hitler accepted it as the operational plan. It had to be canceled because of weather in October. It had to be canceled again. It had to be canceled again in December. In January, a German Luftwaffe staff officer was flying around and got forced down over Belgium by bad weather, and he was holding the whole operational plan. So they had to come up with a new plan. It was a very daring one for an armored drive through the Ardennes forest. Zickelschnitt, the Germans called it, the cut of the scythe. That was the golden moment for military operations in the 20th century, which smashed the French army and drove the British army off the continent in a humiliating retreat that could only be carried out by abandoning all of your equipment. And it made a great movie. I enjoyed the film recently, but we always have to remember that Churchill even said, you don't win wars by successful evacuations. And let us remember that he should know what he's talking about. The British entered Norway to face the Germans there, got beaten badly, had to evacuate. The continent had to evacuate at Dunkirk. They went to Greece to fight the Germans and oppose the Germans in Greece, got beaten badly, had to evacuate. They evacuated to Crete, where they got hit by an all-airborne operation by the German paratroopers. They had to evacuate again. So, it got to the point where BEF didn't stand for British Expeditionary Force, but back every Friday. That was the comedians in London were saying that at the time. So, and then the opening campaign into the Soviet Union, which was successful again as any military campaign has ever been the first 2 or 3 months, still boggle the mind in terms of distance, speed, numbers of prisoners, and absolute operational superiority. The encirclement in front of Kiev, 750,000 Soviet prisoners of war. It's still today a mind-boggling figure. So it's an inadequate strategy, but boy, it come pretty close. And by the end of it, German patrols were 15 miles away from the Kremlin in December of 1941. They'd run out of gas and steam, and they clearly hit their culmination point, as Clausewitz would call it, the moment when you cannot go any further. But it's hard for me to see what the Germans might have done any better in those first 2 years of the war. Now, Soviets managed to hit them with a counterattack in December 1941 of 17 fresh armies that they had been assembling in secret or shipping in from Siberia via the single-track Trans-Siberian Railroad. And the Germans were not just held in front of Moscow or driven back. They were blown away with extremely heavy casualties, and it looked for a time like the army was about to dissolve altogether. I would say, I don't really go for a turning point in World War II, but that was, to me, the most important battle of World War II, in which the Germans, who had suffered almost no casualties up till this point in the war, I'm exaggerating for a fact, that they had taken 2 million prisoners in the West and suffered a little over 100,000 casualties. So I'm exaggerating, but they suffered very light casualties. Now suddenly suffered 1 million. And if you started the Germans out at the beginning of the war and said, there's going to be a battle in which you'll lose 1 million men, they would say, well, we better not even fight this war, because that means something has gone badly wrong in our traditional way of war, of winning victories early in the campaign. And so your question, I'm sorry for circling back by that long detour, but was there anything operational the Germans could have done? In 42 they tried, and that was to launch one big operation in the Eastern Front. The United States was not yet in the war. Well, it had declared war. The Germans had declared war. It wasn't in the war, but it was not yet in Europe and wouldn't be for some time. So they tried an offensive in the east. Now they no longer could do an offensive in the entire Eastern Front. They chose the southern portion of it, heading toward the Caucasus. Possession of Caucasus oil, the oil fields of Baku, for example, even today are important, and the possession of the oil fields of the Caucasus would allow Germany to wage war indefinitely, so theoretically. But notice the Germans could no longer run a full-size campaign from Baltic Sea to Black Sea. They lacked the troops and tanks for that. But you know, they lacked the troops and the tanks even for what they tried to do. First Panzer Army went into the 1942 offensive towards Stalingrad and the Caucasus at about 30% of its allotted strength in tanks. In one of the OKW planners, the High Command of the Wehrmacht, wrote a memorandum saying that we have to face it, some degree of demotorization is going to be necessary in this campaign. The troops in the field, the Germans had 4 field armies, and there was an Italian field army, 2 Romanian field armies, and an Italian field army. The Italians, Hungarians, and 2 Romanians. I mean, they were the ones really increasingly bearing the burden. All of them moved a bit too slowly to seal the deal, either taking Stalingrad or blasting their way through the Caucasus. They got to Maikop, one of the oil cities. The Soviets had demolished it pretty badly. They moved a bit too slowly for all the reasons I just mentioned, and were unable to seal that campaign off. And again, that one ended in disaster, true disaster, not just blowing an army away and having it reform, but actually encircling one, 220,000 men at the outset of that campaign. I'm talking about the 6th Army at Stalingrad. So the answer to your question is no. I don't think they're... And in 1943, the Germans would launch one last offensive, and now they can only muster 2 armies. And that was against Kursk. So you see in 41, big theater-wide offensive, 42, half-size offensive, 43, pint-size offensive. And that offensive went nowhere. Didn't even break through the frontline Soviet tactical defenses. So I don't think, and that's the whole point of the book. That's why I laughed earlier, you know, it's kind of a tough character arc. It's not like when the Soviets attack in Belarus in 1944, you're going to say to yourself, I bet the Germans are going to hold them off. You know, if you've been reading the previous 20 pages, you know that's not going to happen.
Yeah, I know reading this, you often lay out the order of battle for the Germans, yes, and then come in and say, well, just have to remember all of these units are half strength,
yeah,
below, or 10%.
If I may, just go up to the D-Day, the Normandy campaign. I work at the National World War II Museum. Please come see us. I give you all a personal invitation to come see us. We used to be the D-Day Museum, and now we are the National World War II Museum, so we do the whole war. But D-Day is near and dear to our hearts at the museum. It's our origin story. You know, the German defenses at D-Day. So the trope is, the Americans and British broke the defenses of Hitler's fortress Europe and beat the best that the Germans had to offer. I love that kind of talk. I don't necessarily think it's true. So there was 65 German divisions defending in the West, which how exactly you measure the coastline, it's far too few divisions even to come close to defending that coastline. It'd have been enough if France was about half as big. So you don't have enough divisions. Of those 65 divisions, 55 of them are infantry or some sort, and of those 55, 30 of those 55 are static. They have no transport. They don't have horse-drawn wagons. They have no transport. They've been plunked down in a bunker on the coastline, and their job is to fire. And at Omaha Beach, they did so quite well. We all know that. The Omaha Beach landing was almost a tactical disaster. They fired quite well there. They didn't come close to stopping the British and Canadians at the other beaches, nor did they come close to stopping the Americans at Utah Beach, even within a mile of doing so. Within all those divisions, there was virtually every one of them had one or more battalions, so-called of Eastern troops, Osttruppen as they were called. Eastern troops, captured Soviet prisoners of war from various nationalities who were put into a German unit and taught a few rudimentary words of German. Feuer is one you need to know. Jawohl is another one you probably need to know. And they fought, about as well as you could expect them to fight. But that is to say, not all that well. Why would anyone expect them to fight? So that's the German defenses in Normandy. Now, if you're keeping track of my numbers, there's 10 still unaccounted for, and those are panzer divisions. Modern, mechanized, brand new Mark IV, Mark V or Mark VI tanks, usually Mark V tanks, the so-called Panther. And they're fine divisions. But so what do you do with them? Rommel said, well, they have to be at the water's edge to hit the Allies just when they land. Rundstedt said, no, that they'll be under Allied naval gunfire if we do that. We have to keep them back, and they'll counterattack at an appropriate moment. And Rommel said, you don't know what it's like to fight the Americans and the British. They have control of the air. Movement by day will be impossible. Movement by night will be a nightmare. You know, he's right. And Rundstedt was right. So when there's no good solution to an operational problem, you have to trace it back to some of the problems we're talking about.
So one more question from me, and then
Sure.
I think we'll open
we have one
up
from
a few questions from the audience.
Sure.
So this is the project on military and diplomatic history, and we're always looking for some of the larger lessons we can draw from history and apply to some of our present
Sure.
problems. And I'm curious, what you would say, beyond just World War II, what can we learn about, leadership, duty and responsibility down as well as up, and political or civilian control of the military? What can we learn about these things from the story of?
Yes and yes. I like both of what you just said. Obviously, well, civilian control of the military is a tough one in this context. It all depends who your civilian is. I mean, Hitler was a civilian. So Hitler did stand for a kind of modern war making of civilian and political. I'll say political would be better, I think. Hitler did stand for a kind of modern model of political control of the military. In that sense, he is more modern than a Rundstedt, the field marshal who came up out of the old school, who thinks that war's on. It's time to let the generals plan the operations. And so the generals would say, we're going to retreat from Nikolopol. And Hitler would say, you can't do that. It's the last manganese mine we have in our possession. And they would say, so what? And Hitler said, because we have 17 days of manganese left. and if we lose these, we're going to lose the war. So, I mean, he was constantly trying to remind them of politics and economics. And in admittedly a non-systematic way, Hitler was capable of memorizing all sorts of statistics and then ramming them down your throat in a 15-minute conversation until you wanted to scream. Everyone who came into contact with him said that. So civilian control is a tough one. Loyalty below, I just think that the definition of loyalty is not simply obeying your superior, whether it's in private life or public life or in military life. You have responsibility as well as authority as a commander, and you're a man under authority, as the centurion once said. But beneath you, there are men who also look to you for protection of their lives, and I think both of those have to be taken into account. I think the United States Armed Services have a pretty good record on that point. I brag about it all the time. Schorner executed thousands of his own men. Patton almost lost his career for slapping one. Two. The second time was unforgivable. Patton had 2 slapping incidents of exhausted soldiers in a hospital in Sicily. A lot of people, at the War College, at the National World War II Museum, we get a fairly conservative crowd, and we tell them the Patton story, and they say, oh, well, he's putting some backbone into this guy, or, he's slapping some sense into him. And it's just U.S. officers don't lay hands on their personnel. It's just not the way we roll in the United States, and it makes me proud to be an American. So I think that's something that we constantly need to keep in mind. I think if there's a broader lesson of this book for the present, though, when I think of the officer corps, we talk about them fighting World War II. But really, in their heart of hearts, they were fighting World War I. I think it was the most important psychological touchstone to them, that they were on their guard for any signs of a repeated stab in the back or a new sign of a stab in the back, as they believed had led to defeat in World War I. So I think of the Chinese officer corps today, and I think of the educated Chinese I know, and I move in circles that enable me to know a number. And the amount of time we spend talking about the opium wars is sometimes really shocking to me. Because opium wars mean very little to most Americans. That's why it's shocking to me. I'm a historian. I know why they're important. But, humiliation at the hands of the West. And if there's one thing, for example, China today is determined to avoid, it's another form of humiliation at the hands of the West. At least it strikes me. I'm not an expert on Chinese affairs. But there is a Chinese officer corps out there, and I bet they have certain core beliefs that it would be interesting to penetrate and get to know something about. And for that reason, a broader point I would make is, the knowledge of foreign languages. Absolutely essential.
Sure.
I'm able, I think, to get a little better handle on this officer corps for one reason is I've taken some time to learn German. I can read German real well. And I've spent a long time, soaking in those archives. I think I have a sense for the rhythm of military German speak in particular in a way that maybe other authors haven't. But I think of the outbreak of the Vietnam War, and there's an old wives' tale perhaps, but maybe it's true. There were 4 Vietnamese speakers in the State Department at the time. I don't know what the number is, but let's admit it was obviously going to be pretty small. So I think that the importance of military culture, if I want to study a foreign military, I like to know more about their culture, about the way they speak to one another. I like to read their professional literature, which we often think is kind of dry, but I've been reading German professional military literature for a lifetime. I have 3 daughters who are now grown and gone, so they're all grown up and doing wonderful things. But around the dinner table, I would say, you see kids, and they would know they're about to get a 20-minute discussion of German civil military relations in the 1920s. I became fascinated with it. And I really do think that I don't know if that's a solution, but the path to greater knowledge of either friends or potential adversaries or anyone in between is probably to know something about their culture. And I think the best way to know something about that is to learn the foreign language.
Excellent.
Sure, thank you.
So we have a couple microphones
All right.
In the back.
This is the fun part.
Let's start
Take
with
my
you,
jacket
right there in the
roll
back.
up my sleeve.
And if you could please
Yes.
state your name.
Elizabeth
for your
Clifford. Could you go back to the Western Front?
Always.
June 44, July, when the German army in Normandy is shattered.
Yes.
We had the great good fortune to go on your fabulous trip to Normandy.
Oh.
And as moving as the beaches are,
Yeah.
the part I will never forget is driving down that, what was then a dirt road, the only road out east.
Yeah.
They were being strafed day and night.
Yeah.
And at the very end, we walked over a tiny bridge that was a creek
Yeah.
that the last German soldiers had to cross. Could you describe that breakout?
Sure. So you're talking about the battle of the so-called Falaise Pocket? And immediately afterwards. So yes, it's what individual German soldiers on the micro level went through in some of these battles simply beggars the imagination because they had lost the firepower battle. And so we like to give books titles, I think, of SLA Marshall's Men Against Fire, which is a great title for a book, but it's nothing I ever want to experience. But the German army experienced the phenomenon of men against fire late in the war, and that they had just lost the firepower battle, especially in the air. There was no air cover overhead. So the Allies had broken out of Normandy in Operation Cobra, and they had made a loop into the Brittany Peninsula to the west, and then a loop towards the German border. This is Patton's great drive across central France through Le Mans and coming. So he's on the southern wing of the German armies. He comes up and he's almost meeting a northern arm coming down from Montgomery, and they've just about made contact near the town of Falaise. And so the Germans call this the Falaise Kessel, the Falaise encirclement. And you're talking about maybe 3 miles by 5 miles wide and 150,000 German troops trapped there. And every inch of it is being raked by Allied fire, whether aerial bombing or short-range mortars, long-range artillery, heavy machine guns, tanks being used as just simply indirect fire. I mean, they're not maneuvering, they're simply being used as extra artillery. And there's really nowhere to go. And the Germans try desperately to find what cover they can find during the day, and then, which is often, their own equipment or sometimes the bodies of their own comrades, and then try to make their way east. That is towards the last little bridge still open. And it's the scene of carnage. There's maybe 5 times in the 20th century that anything like this has happened. It's a scene of absolute carnage. The wreckage of 5 or 10 German divisions, of 4 of whom were armored or mechanized, so that means vehicles, all kind of piling towards this one little road, and then tanks or trucks breaking down and being thrown off the road or thrown off the bridge so that the soldiers can get by. Every inch of it, again, is still, as the Allies realize what is happening, they lay on the firepower against this crossing site. And, the Falaise Pocket is usually described in Allied histories as a failure, because a lot of Germans escaped from it. The Allies were kind of slow in closing the final gate to that pocket. Either Patton didn't move rapidly enough or Montgomery didn't move rapidly enough. All depends who you're talking to. Patton or Montgomery, they each have their own ideas. But a lot of German commanders escaped. So, most of the divisional staffs and the corps staffs escaped from the Falaise pocket. And that's important because they're going to be allowed to reform. They'll reform the armies along the German border. We'll have to fight another campaign to get into Germany. But if you were there, the Falaise pocket, if you were 90% of the people, 95% of the people who were at the Falaise pocket, those who were there know that they lived through an absolute Armageddon. And, Paul Karel is the sort of popular German historian of World War II. He wrote by Paul Karel, but his real name is Karl Paul Schmidt, and he was official of Ribbentrop's Foreign Office, and a thoroughly disreputable character. But he entitled his chapter on Falaise, "The Hölle von Falaise," the hell of Falaise, the Armageddon of Falaise. And I've walked that ground many times, and it's haunted. There's too many people died in that little spot. There's a few places like that if you travel around, World War II battle sites, but that is definitely one of them. One of the others for me would be Stalingrad. If you ever travel to Stalingrad, it's quite something to see.
You in the back, sir.
You mentioned briefly the issue of unconditional surrender.
Yes.
And I'd hope you could expand a little bit on that, because if you think about it, it's hard to imagine that if the Allies had not taken that position, that there would not have been tens of millions of lives that would not have been lost. But then you might well say 15 years later there'd be a nuclear war.
Yes,
who knows? But could you expand a little bit on that? And maybe a way to do it is to say, what would have happened had the Allies not demanded unconditional surrender? And I know it's not the subject of today's discussion. You might also make a side comment about the war in the Pacific, where the same conditions applied.
Sure. Yes, I said in the talk, well, let's leave that one hanging, because you could argue it both ways. All German officers in their memoirs did say it was something that kept them in the field. No self-respecting military or self-respecting state could ever submit to unconditional surrender. Sounds like the end of your national existence. In the course of the war, we have a number of diaries from Germans of high stations and low stations and everyone in between that are increasingly coming to light and being published. And at least there we see on more than a few occasions, unconditional surrender was welcomed. It was an announcement that there would be no post-war Hitler. That Hitler had no role to play in any kind of post-war settlement. So, for example, if you were a resistance type engaged in some kind of resistance, whether inside Germany or in one of the occupied territories, unconditional surrender was music to your ears. You're risking your life for that possibility, just for that future. That's exactly why you're risking your life at the moment. So there is that. It's entirely possible, so to take your counterfactual, so no unconditional surrender. It's entirely possible for me to imagine German generals doing exactly what they had done in the course of the battles described in this book, even in the absence of unconditional surrender. Because for all the other reasons I talked about, the bribes and the memories of World War I and the fear of Soviet retribution when they came, if and when the Soviet armies broke into Germany. There was a very, how to describe it? There was a large number of German officers, mainly those captured at Stalingrad by the Soviets, but later at other battles as well, who took part, formed a committee called Free Germany, and then the League of German Officers, who actively propagandized their comrades to surrender, made broadcasts, leaflet drops. By and large, they had no real impact. Stalin thought they might have some impact, and he gave them put some real resources behind them. And the real test case was this encirclement at Korsun in early 1944, the so-called Korsun pocket, when Seydlitz, one of the commanders captured Stalingrad. Leaflets bearing his name were dropped into the pocket saying, "You're all going to be killed. The Germans were surrounded there. It's going to be Stalingrad all over again. You'll be treated well, blah, blah, blah." It had no impact at all, apparently. And then Stalin, as the Soviet armies got closer and closer to Germany, I think he said, "I don't need this." And they sort of became common prisoners. But there have been a surprising number of them. Many went on to careers in the East German military after the communist half of Germany, communist sector of Germany after the war. And so, unconditional surrender was, there was apparent solidarity on the German home front, but that's not to say there was real solidarity. Many people were biding their time and safely keeping their opinions to themselves. And unconditional surrender was not was not a horrifying thought to all of them. It meant that there would be no Hitler in the post-war, and Germany could re-enter the family of nations as it had once, been a proud member. So it's a difficult question, and it can be argued a lot of different ways. The Japanese example is fascinating because the Casablanca Declaration applied to the Japanese as well, unconditional surrender. And the Japanese knew that. Truman sent the Japanese a notification. We have this extremely powerful, made a declaration of Potsdam. We have an extremely powerful bomb, and we're going to drop it on you, and you accept unconditional surrender. And a bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and the Japanese fought on. They barely acknowledged the bomb being dropped on Hiroshima, and dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki. And the Japanese commanders, the service chiefs, if you will, the Big Six, they met in session and on whether to continue the war, and they split 3-3. So that meant there were 3 Japanese service chiefs who said, yeah, bring it on, more atom bombs. But it might be a better way of looking at that to say that they arranged the split deliberately beforehand so that the emperor would be forced to show his hand. The emperor would be forced to intervene. As you know, the emperor did intervene and said it's time to stop the war, and the war was stopped. Remember, the Japanese had the one objection to unconditional surrender was they want to keep the emperor. Which is, this is fascinating. We said, no, it's unconditional. We dropped 2 atomic bombs, and they finally agreed to surrender, and we let them keep the emperor. So in a sense, if that was the last condition that they held as an incontrovertible demand, it was met. Of course, it was granted, so that you can, if face is saved on both sides, the emperor remains. The Americans say, well, we granted it. It wasn't really a condition. You put yourself into our hands. But the end of the war in the Pacific was a much messier end of the war than the end of the war in Europe, with just troops fighting their way into the enemy capital.
Let's see, right there, ma'am. We have a microphone right behind you.
Yeah, my question is on Nazi gold in Switzerland.
Oh.
And I was reading Pack of Thieves, and basically it had to do with the requisition of goods and everything, and that was then created the Nazi gold. As the Germans went everywhere, sending people to the camps, all their goods and properties and businesses,
artwork too.
and in the book it said that the Nazi gold extended the war by 2 years. So there was a lot of tens of billions of dollars of Nazi gold, and of course Bletchley Park says their efforts ended the war. They prevented the war from extending 2 more years. So could you please explain? If there was that much Nazi gold, that means that these soldiers who were fighting and eventually were going to surrender, they were able to have access to this gold at some point in their lives once they got out of their imprisonment.
How much? It's a good question. The Nazi occupation economy was a looting economy. It was a smash and grab economics. It wasn't conquering territories to further develop them and turn them into blooming landscapes of economic prosperity. It was to loot them. Any estimates about what anything did to shorten the war is nothing more than an estimate, and it's usually because the author has a pet project, like Nazi gold or Bletchley Park, or air power, which is said to have shortened the war by 6 months in the eyes of some current, recent authoritative studies I've seen on it. So you have to understand when we come for that, whenever you say how long it extended the war. But certainly, German looting of foreign economies and foreign individuals under, incarcerated unfairly or hauled off to concentration or death camps, German looting definitely extended the war. It added gold and added resources to the German treasury that wouldn't otherwise have been there. Much of it remains unfound, though, to this day, which means it had been squirreled away by individuals, which means it had been kind of, so first you loot, then you embezzle. It had been looted from its owners, but now clearly some dishonest forces within the German state, government, military were embezzling it, that is, squirreling it away for their own private use. I don't know what the final disposition of the Polish gold train was. The most recent gold train that was alleged to have been found. Apparently excavations are being carried on. There's been some seismic data that indicates there's some heavy metals buried under the earth, but we won't know the size of that until it's brought forth. So it's incontrovertible that the Holocaust, in some way, just writ large, added to German prosperity in the late 1930s. It was a lot of confiscated wealth in the same sort of way that the early Soviet Union, the Bolsheviks, extorted all sorts of wealth and seized all sorts of wealth from the former ruling classes, as they were styled. They were liquidated, and then they were liquidated, and their wealth was in the hands of the state. And there's no doubt that the Bolsheviks were able to finance portions of the Civil War against the whites, for example, from looting. It's not a long-term path to success. My caveat is it's not a long-term path to success. Once you've looted and the wealth is gone, then you're kind of back where you started. And you're perhaps looking for new people from whom to loot or new territories to conquer.
You right here in the front, sir.
You finally got your call. Make it good, man.
Hopefully. Eric Gomez from the Cato Institute. I am wondering about North Korea in the current context. And one of the major questions that's sort of come up in discussions of should the U.S. attack or not is the fighting willpower of the North Korean military.
Yes.
And would it, if Kim Jong-un were to be killed or if he were to be disarmed of his nuclear weapons in a overly optimistic first strike, would then the conventional forces just say, okay, we give up because they're underfed or what have you? So in your experience studying the German military losing in this, I know it's not a perfect case, but are there any sort of general things we should be looking for in peacetime to get clues as to how the KPA might function were a new Korean war to start?
I read my historical colleague, someone I've never met, but who I read a lot, Bruce Cummings, who talks a lot about the North Korean state and North Korean military. And it's a state that was built really on the grounds of anti-Japanese resistance, and it's a state that was built of guerrilla fighters. What we often style in the Korean War is the collapse of the North Korean military after Incheon, when the United Nations forces were hurtling over the parallel and toward the Yalu. Really now seems to have been a voluntary dissolution of the North Korean army into smaller sized guerrilla units. So that's the way it's being written now. I'm a little bit outside I'm outside my lane perhaps, but that's the way it's being written now by scholars whom I respect. So, a good question to start with is what would have happened to the Wehrmacht had Hitler been killed? So it's one of the possibilities you just said about what would happen to the North Korean military. Certainly there was a plot to do so, and there have been some officers who agreed to step forth and lead some kind of new regime. And if I were a North Korean intelligence specialist dealing with North Korean American, I'd be looking very, very carefully for signs of some sort of dissatisfaction or for signs of certain kinds of officerly ambition that might be coming to the fore. I'm sure a trained not psychoanalyst, but sort of a psychointelligence agency or a psychointelligence agent would be able to look for some of those signs. So it's a little bit difficult to say, but I'd be very wary of a simplistic notion that, I will say this, killing Kim will lead to a collapse of the North Korean military. I'd be pretty skeptical of that notion based on what I know about the German army. I probably should say no more before I humiliate myself. No, it's all right. I'm willing to answer anything to my best of my ability. Sir.
You mentioned...
Get the mic, I think.
We have a mic coming.
You mentioned the Germans who collaborated with the Soviets. I've always been fascinated how von Paulus ends up as the head of East Germany.
Oh, yeah, right. So, the question is about German officers who collaborated with the Soviets, and you especially bring forward the example of Friedrich Paulus, the German 6th Army commander. So he was taken prisoner at Stalingrad. You may know the unusual circumstances. The German troops were in the pocket in Stalingrad for over 2 months, and refused to allow to surrender or to break out or do anything, really, but sit there by Hitler. And Paulus never argued with those orders, as he certainly could have. He was 1,000 miles away from Hitler, and there was nothing Hitler could do to him at the moment, but Paulus remained loyal. When all was lost and the food was out and the ammunition was out, Paulus sent a message to Fuhrer headquarters saying, the struggle is over. Hitler promoted him to field marshal on the historical notion that no German field marshal had ever surrendered before. By the way, I'm not even sure it's true. We'd have to look at it. There's some cases that are kind of ambiguous in the past. So Paulus was granted the field marshal's baton by radio and then surrendered. He had had enough, clearly. The Kessel experience had broken him in a certain sense. Those who were with him at that time, he always had kind of a lazy eye. Now he's gotten a facial tic that was becoming increasingly obvious. It's a person under immense stress, right? So he's under immense stress, and that the surrender seemed to have loosened him completely. His Soviet captors, military interrogators, talk about how relaxed he seemed. Being taken prisoner by the Soviet army, you'd think the last thing you'd have is a sense of relaxation, but compared to what he'd been through, he was being fed a couple of hot meals a day and was in relative comfort as opposed to living in the unheated ruins of the main department store in downtown Stalingrad, which is where his headquarters had been. So he is one of those who joins this BDO, Bund Deutschen Offiziers, the League of German Officers, BDO. Along with most of the other generals captured at Stalingrad, including one of the real tough guys of the German officer corps, Friedrich Seydlitz, the descendant of the great cavalry commander from the Frederick the Great's time. He had been commander of virtually all the infantry forces at Stalingrad. And the two of them and numerous other generals, I think there's 20 generals taken prisoner at Stalingrad. And then they've been added to some other battles already, and there's a lot more to come after 1944. And so, again, they do their best. In the Cold War, they were condemned as Stalinist lackeys, condemned by us in the West, in West Germany as well, as Stalinist lackeys. And maybe in some sense, I totally understand that. But Seydlitz said, whatever happens to Germany can't possibly be worse than what's going to happen to Germany if we continue the war. Paulus said the same thing. What is happening, what will happen in the next 12 months will beggar our imaginations. We can't even paint the picture. Germany will be in flames from one corner to the other. And so a communized Germany may not last forever, but destruction does last forever. This is the kind of arguments they were making at the time. And there's no doubt they were rewarded, according to Soviet and communist lights, by high positions in the East German military. Paulus was the commander of these, I forget what the exact title was, but essentially the commander-in-chief of the East German Volksarmee in its early years of its founding. And he'd lived for the rest of his life in East Germany. His former West German colleagues, his West German former colleagues, went on a 15-year campaign of character assassination against him, saying he'd always been disloyal, he never really cared about his men, and he'd always probably secretly been a communist. He was often accused of secretly being a communist, which is ridiculous. Paulus was perhaps the least inspiring military leader of the 20th century. He fought an inept campaign in Stalingrad, attempting to fight his way through the city. Stalingrad's like a rectangle, sits along the Volga, long, but not very deep. So he kind of fought his way from the bottom of Stalingrad to the top of Stalingrad the long way. It's almost as silly as fighting your way up the Italian peninsula from the south to the north. Oh, sorry, I didn't say that. You got me on camera saying that. It's not really a wise operational decision, so I have nothing good to say about Paulus as a military commander. But I've always tried to take phenomena like the BDO and analyze them on their own terms rather than through a Cold War lens of pro or anti-communism.
Let's see, you sir, right here.
Herb Rose. I'm going to take you a little bit out of your area of comfort.
Well, we already went to North Korea, so nothing you do could possibly be.
Right, and ask you to speculate quite a bit, but if you compare the German soldier, and you're concentrating more on the officer group,
more.
but with the Japanese soldier who was found in various islands a decade or more hiding out in trees and living off the land, or in caves and living off the land, if the situations had been reversed, would you have found many of the German troops doing the same sort of thing?
So if the Germans were fighting in the Pacific.
Yeah,
wow.
Exactly.
I love me some counterfactual. That's about the best one I've ever heard. One of the things I At the museum, we try to be fair and even-handed, and for every word we print on the war in Europe, we try to print something on the war in the Pacific and vice versa. So we almost never talk about the Germans without the Japanese, and almost never the Japanese without the Germans. Some of the Italians, I am Italian of Italian ethnicity, they get short shrift, and I guess that we're just going to have to accept that. But I've really spent a career talking about World War II, trying to demythologize the Japanese soldier somewhat in terms of loyalty to the concept of Bushido and other things. This is said to be an 800-year-old samurai tradition, which is, it's more equivalent to me to being in the Hitler Youth. A Japanese soldier in World War II had been thoroughly propagandized his whole life about the brilliance, the majesty and divinity of the emperor, but the brilliance of the Japanese military and the weakness and decadence of the soldiers and sailors that be fighting them. So I think that's how I see it anyway. So I think when you have Japanese soldiers still in Guadalcanal or wherever they are in the interior, this dense triple canopy jungle, still wandering around and occasionally, still presenting themselves to the outside world. Yeah, I personally think that if German soldiers had been fighting the war in the Pacific completely out of communications and out of any sort of social or human intercourse, I don't know, somehow you've lost your unit. You've wandered off and you never found them again, and they've disappeared. Somehow you fell into a hole or whatever it might be. Some of the Japanese stories are quite unusual as to how they came to be lost. I think if German soldiers had been put in those kind of unusual situations, I see no reason why some of them might not still be wandering around Papua New Guinea. I mean, to me, it's a question without a firm answer, of course, and you're free to differ on that point. I think every nation does evolve a kind of way of war. I've written a book called The German Way of War, and Russell Weigley famously wrote a book called The American Way of War, about how different cultures, military cultures, evolve different ways of looking at the battlefield and understanding what they're doing. So certainly there are differences between the German and Japanese way of war. I think the Japanese knew they could not compete on the level of technology, and so they felt themselves or saw themselves as forced to rely more on the human factor, to inculcate a sense of human superiority, which is extremely deadly under modern conditions, and the Japanese proved that repeatedly in the course of the war. I'm thinking of all-out, we call them banzai charges, but essentially all-out shock charges by infantry against well-defended American positions. By and large, Germans didn't do that. Germans were always looking for a weak spot in a flank. So I mean, there's certainly differences that we could find between the Germans and Japanese, but the specific case you mentioned of being trapped on a desert island like Gilligan, outside of any contact with the outside world, I think it is possible that German soldiers could be wandering around some abandoned or some obscure island in the South Pacific up to the present day. Yeah. It's a good question, though. It's a good question.
I think we have time for one or two more.
Well, right, yeah, I am staying across the street, so as you know, I mean, I can always come back anytime.
Have you, sir, in the back?
Thank you. This was really interesting. My name is Will Staten, and curious, you just made a point about Hitler's, stay order in Stalingrad. You talked about how a lot of the officer corps and even many of the enlisted soldiers had kind of bought into the ideologies. And so I'm wondering to what extent you think the idea of Lebensraum and Hitler's kind of refusal, especially on the Eastern Front, to let his troops retreat even a little bit, may have played into the psychology and the reason that the Wehrmacht kept fighting, even after it was obvious the war was over.
Yeah, so one of Hitler's, Idee fix was this notion of Lebensraum, which means living space, that Germany was a crowded nation, as Nazi propagandists always said, about twice the population of France living on the same amount of territory, which is roughly, give or take, it's pretty close to being true. And the Germans had certainly conquered their fill of Lebensraum by December of 1941. And then, if you look at an operational map of the summer 1942 campaign, and it's going to end in disastrous Stalingrad, so it's kind of tough. But if you can forget that for a moment, you have German armies sitting in the Caucasus mountain range. That's a long, long way from Berlin. I don't know how much Lebensraum, that idea, that geopolitical idea, played a part in German steadfastness late in the war. I think I'd turn Lebensraum around a little bit. Part and parcel of the idea of Lebensraum was that there were these wide open spaces that were not being used adequately because the people who inhabited them were subhuman or savage. So I think that Lebensraum has to be linked to that question of racism, of inferior races who are occupying these vast territories which they're not doing anything with, so to say, in the way that we Germans, we Aryan races, the smarter, more organically thinking, clear-thinking races what could we do with this territory? I think that's really the essence of Lebensraum. And once again, I have to say that those racist or racialist ideas are definitely part and parcel of the German Army's worldview, especially the armies fighting in the East. There's a certain amount of, decadent Westerner types of that sort of thought fighting against the Americans. But it was hard to think they were too decadent given the level of technology they had brought to the fight. German soldiers mentioned constantly the disgusting nature of these little hovels that that Russian families live in the forests around Moscow. There's a hole in the ground for a toilet, and the place stinks like cabbage, and on and on and on and on and on and on. So, I think that notion that late in the war, you could say, well, they're getting beaten badly by the Russians, Soviets. How could they possibly think they were fighting an inferior race? Well, the notion of a small band being overwhelmed by hordes of inferior barbarians is hardly foreign to the Western worldview. Probably hardly foreign to anybody's worldview. Any civilized people always fear the barbarians living on the frontier. It's one of our bedrock Western civilization myths of the 300 Spartans against Xerxes. So I think that probably does play Lebensraum, but as I phrased it, racialized Lebensraum probably does have something to do with the German steadfastness in the field, both at the officer level and at the level of the Lanzer. Yeah.
Let's take maybe one more from you right here in the front, sir. We have a...
Jude Sander, I just had a question about German logistics at the end. Like, how was their supply trains? I just don't understand how they maintained the supplies. They had such a diversity of equipment, too. Yeah. They had, like Panthers and all types of different, right? They just had so many types of equipment. Their logistics trail would just have been very difficult, I think. And the other thing is, like...
That's a good question, okay.
Yeah, and the second question is just the payments to the generals. Yeah. Did they keep that after the war? I'm just curious how the reconstruction of the banks after that.
Good, two good questions. Logistics, of course, proved to be the German Achilles heel. German logistics were essentially rail-bound, so the Germans had the finest rail network anywhere in the world, the densest rail network anywhere in the world. It proved remarkably difficult to bomb it into to destroy it, because there was always, you bombed a line, there was always an alternate line. German engineers very skilled at rerouting and repairing very, very quickly. Eventually the key for Allied bombers, and they tried everything. They said, well, we'll hit German synthetic rubber plants. We'll hit German ball bearings. We'll hit oil in Romania at Ploiești, which was Germany's principal source of oil. The Germans always managed workarounds. Finally, and it wasn't until early 1945 that the solution was found, the trial and error, they tried them all, which was to bomb the marshalling yards. These huge, immense, acres and acres and acres of side switches and turntables that form the marshalling yards outside of all of Germany's major cities. I'm thinking especially of the marshalling yards outside Frankfurt. So destroying the marshalling yards outside Frankfurt made it very difficult for the Germans to fight to recover after the Battle of the Bulge and to reform their lines in the west and to ship troops in the east as well. So once off the rail line, at the railhead, it was horse-drawn transport, wagons. And you're right. You mentioned the multiplicity of equipment, the different kinds of models of German tanks. How about the captured tanks? How about all the captured French tanks and the Czech tanks and the Polish and Russian artillery? It's a mess. And while the Germans did all that was humanly possible, I don't think we can ever say they solved the problem. And that's why they're fighting from a position of, one of the reasons they're fighting from a position of material inferiority for the last 2 years of the war that I'm talking about. Were they allowed to keep the payments? Well, so many of them were arrested. So many of them were taken prisoner by the Soviets in the East. And after the war in the West was over, there's a sort of a wholesale roundup. Virtually all of them are taken prisoners in the West. They are put to work writing essays on their way of war, on what it's like to fight the Soviet Union, difficulties of fighting the Russians in the winter, how to survive a battle of encirclement. These foreign military studies, I've spent my whole life swimming in them, my whole professional career. Thankfully, we put those guys to work and made them write. But as prisoners, they had forfeited all the gains they had made under the Third Reich, higher salaries for being generals, but especially dotations, so to say. German currency was worth so little by the end of the war, in the immediate aftermath of the occupation, the Allies now ran the currency system that it was easy to see who had gotten ill-gotten gains and take them away. Now, I don't know if any of them ever smuggled any of that stuff outside of the country, and let's assume some of them did, and so maybe some of them were able to benefit from some of those payments. They're the classic example of ill-gotten gains. I mean, they really are. Norm Goda, a real fine historian, has written a good article on this subject called Black Marks. It's ill-gotten gains. There's nothing good about the money that German generals were getting. If you think about it, is that why Guderian was willing to still, be launching offensives in Pomerania in February and March of 1945? And it clearly lost by now. No one could even doubt it. But keep it going one more month? When's my 50th birthday? I don't know if any of them were asking themselves that question. It's entirely possible they were, because that was a big, fat bonus time, 50th and 60th birthdays.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming, Dr. Cittino.
Thanks, Sam. Good. Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Great. Good session.